Hello everyone and welcome back to Histories Tech, and today we are looking at the M50 Ontos. Now this rather unusual tank was part of a continuous evolution of trying to get armor into remote locations. Originally they were trying to do it by plane. Eventually they figured out a helicopter was a much easier way to move it. So let's go ahead and look at the history of the M50 Ontos. Now, the idea of flying in a tank was nothing new. Since the 1930s, there had been experiments to try and basically fly a tank. Now, most of these involved attaching wings to a tank, seen here with the Antonov A-40. Basically, the idea was to fly it in. If that didn't work, the idea was basically to attach it to an aircraft. However, they all had the same issue. Either you flew the tank in and you had issues with trying to fly a tank, or even dropping it from an aircraft. If it parachuted in, it was extremely vulnerable to attack at that point. This all changed when the development of the helicopter came about. By the 1950s, the usefulness of a helicopter had been seen. The United States had pushed for it for usage for amphibious assaults. The Army showed its resourcefulness as a resource and military operations helicopter during the Korean War. So it was basically inevitable that they were going to start using the newer, larger, heavy lift helicopters for means of transporting vehicles. Now, two vehicles were basically developed in parallel. The M56 Scorpion, which was an unarmored, self-propelled gun with a 90mm cannon and a crew of 4. And this vehicle was actually the one chosen over the M50 Ontos. But let's go ahead and look at the M50 Ontos. The M50 Ontos was not a traditional vehicle in any way, shape, or form. Now, the M50 Ontos being the Greek word for thing, was basically developed as part of an air transportable tank destroyer program that was developed in the early 50s. Now, because of this, it had to be a very small craft that could fit in the back of an airplane and be brought to a remote site, dropped off, and moved. Now, the first prototype of the M50 was problematic. Mainly, it shared a lot of parts with the M56 Scorpion, and because of that, it had some issues, including an issue that it only had a 15 degree of traverse on the turret. Now, a second prototype was developed that had 40 degrees of traverse, a better suspension, and better track system, and this is the prototype that was more favored. Another disadvantage the Ontos had when being compared to the M56 was that it did have 6 recoilless rifles attached to it. However, these had to be loaded from the outside, whereas the M56 could be loaded internally. Because of these problems, the Army would end up canceling their contract for the M50. However, at the time, the Marine Corps was desperate for a new anti-tank vehicle and went ahead and accepted an order of almost 300 M50 Ontos. Now, while the US Marine Corps wanted this vehicle as an anti-tank weapon, during the Vietnam War, which it was deployed with the Marines, it really didn't see hardly any action as an anti-tank weapon, mainly because of the fact that the North Vietnamese Army didn't deploy hardly any tanks. Instead, it played a crucial role as a direct fire support vehicle for infantry in combat. Now, this had never even been thought of as a use for the M50, so the Marines, being Marines, always find a way to adapt and overcome an issue, found that this was the best vehicle possible for in-close fighting. And at 300 to 500 yards, it was found to be an extremely effective vehicle at taking down walls, punching holes in the side of buildings, and providing the Marines an additional support that they would need during the Vietnam War. So because of its relative size and weight, it was one of the only few tracked vehicles that could cross the portable pontoons that were deployed across rivers. And once the M50 was deployed with the CH-53 Sea Stallion, it was basically over. They could deploy these anywhere possible, anywhere needed. Now, sadly, the Marine Corps deactivated their units with the M50 in 1969, and they were actually handed over to Army Light Infantry Brigades at this time. And the Army basically used them for the next year or so until they started breaking down, and since there wasn't replacement parts, they actually started utilizing them as fixed fortifications. Now, this could have been the end of the very short career of the M50 Ontos, but actually, it would still see action with a few other countries. It would take part in the Dominican Civil War, where it would get a tank kill by helping destroy an L-60L Swedish-made light tank, and destroying a French-made AMX-13. Sadly, the career of the Ontos was cut short, only being in service for about 14 years. It basically was relegated to reserve roles and being converted into construction vehicles. Now, it was a very loved vehicle, and because of this, it has been preserved in more than a dozen locations in the United States, and a few of them are actually working tanks. But there you have it, a quick look at one of the more unusual tanks ever made, the M50 Ontos. This tank was a short-lived, kind of an experimental idea to basically create a light anti-tank weapon that could be dropped into the battlefield, and while it did work, it never truly got to fulfill its role as an anti-tank weapon, and instead showed the need for ground support vehicles to support infantry units. But that's it for today. Thank you for joining me, and I look forward to talking to you on the next time.